For years, universities have championed diversity, equity, and inclusion programs as a necessary step toward fairness in education. But now, in 2025, the true meaning and intention of those programs has DEI under attack like never before. And we can't go down without a fight for what we all know is the right thing to do, is the fair thing to do, and the just thing to do. And if you haven't been tracking what's going on with the federal government, let me give you some information. The federal government just this week declared that segregated, yes, segregated facilities are no longer explicitly banned in federal contracts. That was not AI, that was not fake news, that is a reality of what's happening today. And also, just recently, we saw an Idaho sixth grade history teacher stand her grounds after being ordered to remove a classroom sign that simply says, "Everyone is welcome here." Something so innocuous, but so offensive to those on the right. And across the country, universities are scrambling after the Trump administration's executive order threatening to strip federal funding from institutions that refuse to dismantle their DEI programs. Columbia University, yes, that Ivy League university in New York City, one of the most prestigious institutions in this country, has already lost $400 million, yes, millions in federal support. And last night, another seismic shift and Trump's latest stunt. Yes, he will, we don't know if anything is too low for him because we've seen him stoop to levels that we could not have even imagined prior to this election, his second election. But yes, Donald Trump used school children as political pawns just yesterday. We witnessed children sitting at desks as Trump signed an executive order dismantling the Department of Education. Now, as you may know or may not know, but this is why we are here to inform you, the Department of Education was created to level the playing field. Now Trump wants to destroy it under the false pretenses of efficiency. But cutting it won't cut bureaucracy. It will cut opportunity. This is a blatant attack on children, on education, and America's future. From preschools to colleges, what does all of this mean for the future of education in America? And by the way, it's important to note that Donald Trump doesn't even have the power to dismantle a cabinet level department. Only Congress has that authority and that power. But today, we are cutting through the noise to have an important and critical conversation about the future of our students, about the future of education, the future of universities and schools across this nation.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
And joining me today is esteemed civil rights attorney, ordained minister, former CEO and president of the NAACP. He is currently serving as the Hauser Professor of the Practice of Nonprofit Organizations and Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership and Social Justice at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's also the director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the school's Center for Public Leadership. And he's a visiting professor at Harvard Divinity School. This is a very, very busy man. So I'm so excited that he took some time out to join me today, none other than Professor Cornell Brooks. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for the work you're doing at my alma mater, Harvard University. Thank you for your service to the NAACP and just for being one of the leaders, the civil rights leaders that has always been out front on these critical issues. We need your voice more than ever in this moment.
Mm-hmm. So, Areva, may I say at the outset, thank you for having me on the program, and thank you for your voice and your work. You remind me of someone who I deeply admired as a lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, whom, as you know, was called Mr. Civil Rights, not because of all of his wins in the courts, but because he took the time to explain civil rights to regular people, particularly in the Black church. So they called him Mr. Civil Rights. So Ms. Civil Rights, thank you for your work, not only in the courts, right, but also not counting it robbery to talk to real people about the kinds of issues that we're both concerned about. So
well, I take that as the ultimate compliment, Thurgood Marshall. You can't be a Black lawyer without having Thurgood Marshall, top on your list of 1, 2, 3 lawyers that inspired you to do this work. So just being mentioned in a sentence with Brother Thurgood Marshall is really quite overwhelming for me. And in this moment, literally, Professor Brooks, as we are set to have this conversation about institutions, I get a alert on my phone that says Donald Trump has now fired nearly the entire civil rights branch of the Department of Homeland Security, gutting a government office responsible for conducting oversight of Trump's immigration crackdown. And this alert is one of many that we have been getting throughout the days that Donald Trump has been in office. So I just want to ask you, how are you feeling? I mean, you've been through a lot, you've seen a lot, you know the history of civil rights in this country. Just talk to me for a minute about how you're feeling.
I would simply say this. We as a people, we as an American people, certainly we as Black people have come through a lot, lived through a lot, and we know a lot about our history and our struggles and our resilience. But in some ways, the more you know, the more you're outraged. The more you know, the more you find yourself uncomprehending the daily madness coming out of Washington, right? So in other words, where we have a constitutional democracy literally teetering on the pillars, as we have a group of unconstitutional henchmen, like literally sawing at the pillars, destroying the pillars of our country. And so many days I wake up remembering people like Thurgood Marshall, people like Pauli Murray, people like Constance Baker Motley, people like William Monroe Trotter, and I ask myself, if they did all they did with what little they had, why can't we do more with all that we have been given? We have been given a legacy, right? We have been given this tradition of resilience, and not for nothing, their great-grandchildren have often been in the streets on the campus, on the campuses of our universities, protesting, demonstrating, and lifting up their voices. So I say all that to say we can't afford to be depressed. We have to be at work.
And I love how you frame, and I've been using that same frame myself when I feel really down, and I'm talking to my colleagues, my friends who are feeling the same way, reminding myself and them as well about how much got accomplished by those civil rights icons you just identified and how little they had, right? And when we look at what we have to work with, not to mention, the internet, social media, the most advanced technology ever, the ability for you and I, you in Boston and me in Los Angeles to have this conversation. We have to be inspired by that. We have to be encouraged by that. And we cannot in this moment cower, we cannot allow the chaos, which is what it is, the sheer volume of chaos to defeat us in this moment. And clearly, Professor Brooks, that seems to be, right, the playbook, the constant, just the barrage of these executive orders, many of which, let's talk about this one, to so-called dismantle the Department of Education. There was a piece out in the New York Times this morning saying that Trump, of all of his executive orders, those that were in the room as he signed it, said that there seemed to be some ambivalence, that even he knew that this wasn't good for the country, not good for students. He kept asking the 8-year-olds, was this a good thing to do? And kept looking for affirmation, but yet he knows he doesn't have the power to dismantle a cabinet level department, but yet he signs this executive order doing so. Talk about how detrimental is going to be to Black students, brown students, disabled students if we don't have an intact Department of Education?
So let me just start with a biographical revelation. I teach at your alma mater, Harvard. I went to Yale Law School. Before that, Boston University School of Theology. But before then, between Jackson State University, a public HBCU, and the Head Start program, I've spent the majority of my life, the majority of my education, if you will, in public schools, right? So I'm in debt to the legacy, a part of the legacy of the Department of Education. So let's just begin with this. So when the Department of Education was created under President Jimmy Carter, subsequent Republican presidents had promised to dismantle it and were unable to do so, in part because many red state governors, red state senators, red state congressional representatives understand the Department of Education, which really provides a relative minuscule fraction of all the dollars going to public education, provides critical resources for students in poor communities, in rural communities, children with disabilities. Let's be honest here. Most of us don't come from places of opulence and wealth. Most of us come from regular places, regular communities, and we certainly know folks who live in the most ordinary circumstances but accomplish the most extraordinary things on a daily basis. What the president has done without authority, as you well know, is a great lawyer, is that Congress has the power of the purse in terms of allocations. Congress has the power to create federal agencies or to close federal agencies. So the president issues an executive order that says we're going to dismantle the Department of Education to the extent possible, right? So this squirrely, lawyerly language, this kind of wickedly deceptive parenthetical in the executive order, which essentially dismantles the logic of the whole thing, right? So in answer to your question, what does this mean for regular people? This is tremendously consequential, right? Tremendously consequential, because while DOE and Department of Federal, I should say the federal government provides like 10% of all dollars going to federal education, those dollars, though, disproportionately go to those folks who most need them. So, the analogy I would use here, this is a little like in the Black church, where the main offering goes to support the building, right? But there's something called the benevolent offering that goes to help people who are really in need. Right. This, my friends, is the benevolent offering being stolen.
Why do you think, given the consequential nature of this, and as you just brilliantly said, he doesn't have the power of the purse, he doesn't have congressional power to dismantle this federal agency, so the lawyer language in the executive order dismantled to the extent possible, and he talked about the great employees that work at the Department of Education and how so many of the services were going to be transferred to different departments. Why aren't more people jumping up and down, recognizing that this doesn't mean the complete end of the department, but it is the gutting of the department? Folks like those ordinary people you talked about, the congressional leaders, the Senate leaders who are the elected officials for those everyday people in their districts, I'm not hearing the kind of outcry, the kind of outrage you would expect from those people.
I would say that this is, in some ways, more a matter of being stunned than really being afraid, right? So in other words, we had folks on Capitol Hill who know the implications and consequences, but because there's literally a catastrophe a moment, a calamity a moment, a tweet a moment, we have many people in Washington who are simply stunned. They're trying to figure out, where do we begin every day, as opposed to really being afraid of this president, right? And so that's part of the challenge. And part of the challenge, I think, with respect to the public is, in a similar way, the public is stunned. But another part of it is they're trying to figure out, how does this affect me immediately? So we're seeing in the town halls, veterans and other groups responding to these cuts. We're seeing in the town halls anger with respect to the tariffs and inflation and the impact on people's 401ks. When it comes to the Department of Education, the people haven't seen quite yet the implications, the consequences yet. So in other words, when those class sizes swell, when you can't get the educational plan, individualized educational plan for your child, when you can't get the services for your special needs child, then we're going to see these parents and these communities show up in serious ways. And I also believe we're going to see some of these red state governors, right? So I'm from South Carolina, quite red. I went to college in Mississippi, also quite red. Well, the poorest states, the most conservative states, are really the states that get the most federal dollars.
Yes.
And they're going to get hurt.
Now, you said something interesting. You said you don't think it's as much fear as it is folks just being stunned. What do you make of Brad Karp, senior lead partner at the Paul Weiss law firm, one of the preeminent corporate law firms in the country, one of the law firms targeted by Donald Trump, goes to the White House and, according to the New York Times, walks out of a meeting with Trump having committed to donating $40 million to some unknown nonprofits that Donald Trump tells him to donate to, commits to scrubbing that law firm's DEI programs, any DEI scholarships, any hiring practices. And basically, the New York Times says bends in the face of Trump demands. And I should note, and you know this, Professor Brooks, Paul Weiss, Loretta Lynch, former Attorney General, Harvard Law School graduate, Jed Johnson, Homeland Security under Obama, Harvard graduate, Ted Wells.
Oh my gosh.
Preeminent Harvard lawyers, big time litigation partners. This is the makeup.
Yep.
This is the short list of the makeup of Paul Weiss. And remember, it was the Paul Weiss firm, one of the first that started the DEI practice group, for which they got all this praise and all this press around. So is that fair? Or is Brad Karp stunned, as you said?
No, I will apply that verb to those on Capitol Hill. I'll apply that word to regular lay people. In the case of Paul Weiss, I really think they were responding to the pressure of the Trump administration and their perception of the financial consequences. Let's note this. Paul Weiss, as you so rightly lifted up, is a storied firm, a legendary firm with extraordinary lawyers who have supported many of the things you and I both support. But then in addition to that, I got to drop this because I love the history. Paul Weiss is also the law firm that hired Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a summer associate and Pauli Murray as an associate. So at a time when you had both Jim Crow and, as Pauli Murray put it, Jane Crow in full operation, this is the law firm that hires a Jewish woman who was a mother, and Pauli Murray, who was trans and Black and a trailblazer. So I'm going to be honest with you. When I read about this story, I thought I misread it. I said, I got to be getting the headline wrong. This can't be the same law firm, right? So, but I do think they're responding to a couple of things very concretely. So number one, as you well know, the Trump administration canceled their security clearances and access to federal building and making it hard for the lawyers to do their work and do their work in terms of the clients they already had. Point one. Number two, the firm was under some pressure because of a partner who'd investigated Trump participated in the prosecution. So the firm was basically on the back end of retaliation, revenge, and a threat. It's firm-wide. And so I believe they made a cold, calculated commercial decision in terms of their financial interests that it would be better to concede than get in a protracted fight with this administration. And all I can simply say is I respect the lawyers. I completely, wholeheartedly disagree with that decision. And I would argue it's not consistent with who they are.
So let's put a pin there because that's an important point I want to come back to. I was on a call this morning with one of your Yale Law graduates, graduate alums, who's on the board at Yale Law, and told me he was talking to Stanford lawyers who had reached out to him, Stanford dean, because Stanford is fearful of the loss of federal dollars. And 40% of the funding for the Stanford Law School comes from Stanford University. So if the university takes a hit, the law school takes a hit. So I said to this judge, I'm so disappointed in Harvard and Yale and Paul Weiss and all these big institutions because one, legally, they know these executive orders, many of them are just unconstitutional, illegal, not enforceable.
Right.
And two, they have the money, the endowment that a Yale Law School, a Harvard Law School, the university, even beyond the law schools has. So if these big institutions like Columbia, like Harvard, like Stanford, like Yale, like Paul Weiss, Covington, I mean, go down and call the roll on these big corporate firms, if they don't stand up in this moment, who is going to stand up?
That is an excellent question because up until now, in terms of this chapter of resistance, the lawyers and the federal judges have been the foot soldiers. Higher education, the colleges and the universities, less so. They filed some great briefs. There have been some lawsuits challenging DEI and the withdrawal of this funding. I do think in this next chapter, higher education has to adopt a different strategy and a different end goal. And what I mean by that is this. Heretofore, we've let the lawyers do the talking and law school deans, college presidents have been more muted. We can't afford that. Johns Hopkins University was threatened with an $800 million cut, devastating. Columbia, as you noted, $400 million cut. I can simply say, for example, at your alma mater, in my institution, there's a hiring freeze. Harvard has not done that in centuries of its existence, right? Centuries, right? And so the point being is timidity is no defense, right? You're not going to get any points at this point. You're not going to inoculate yourself from these basic lawless attacks by muting your voice. So we're at this point right now where we literally have to take a much more visible, assertive posture because you're not going to buy literally time or concessions or moderation by doing anything else. So point one. Point two, I would note this. Even when your university has not been subject to these cuts, it influences what happens at the university. How so? When we have universities who provide executive education for federal programs or federal employees, when you have a approved vocabulary list in the government now, you can't talk about racism, you can't talk about diversity, that influences what the universities do. Point one. Point two, every professor right now is looking over their shoulder, wondering who's going to come after them. Let me break this down because I want everybody to appreciate this. I just found out like maybe a week ago, apparently I'm on some kind of watch list for professors. I think there are like maybe 10 of us at Harvard. So we have been identified, put on this watch list because of what we teach, right? Now, here's my point. That has a chilling effect.
Hold on a second, Professor Brooks. Is this a watch list being maintained by Harvard, or is this a MAGA watch list?
This is a watch list started by Charlie Kirk during the first Trump administration. It is circulated in hard right, far right, extreme right circles, and your quotes are placed on this watch list. But my point being is the watch list with the anti-DEI initiatives, with the funding cuts, creates an atmosphere, I would call it almost a hostile work environment for academic freedom. Right? So we need to be very clear about this. And it's not just like schools that, like Harvard that are affected. Here's what I would say to any tuition paying parents out there. Why is the government using its vast resources to underteach your children?
Right.
So you take your hard-earned paycheck to pay tuition, books, room and board, to send your child off to school, and they're being undertaught. How are they being undertaught? When there are subjects that you got to step around. When there are things you're worried about teaching. Do you talk about history? Do you talk about history accurately? Do you talk about the law accurately? You shouldn't be paying for that. That's the moment that we're in, right? State universities, right, that have big brother government trying to run their universities. Last point, how is it that we are using research dollars used to advance cancer research, Alzheimer's research, research related to hypertension? How are we using the cutting of those dollars to address DEI?
You raise a good point about parents. I love what you're saying. You're saying parents, you're paying this $90,000, $150,000, this really, a high price education, whether it's Harvard or, BU or whatever school. All colleges are very expensive, but yet you're not allowing, or you're supporting the stifling of the education process, because we're allowing the government to dictate what the curriculum should be rather than the professors and the educators and the historians and the scholars who should be dictating that. And it's kind of funny because I was having this conversation, this text with my producer about our taxes. We're taxpayers. If the government is being dismantled, if all of these government agencies are being dismantled and tens of thousands of employees are being fired and buildings are being sold off, as we're being told, what are our tax dollars going to? Why are we paying taxes to support the dismantling of the government? Presumably our taxes were being paid to help support and fund these agencies and the research dollars and the dollars coming out of the government. But if the goal is to privatize, if the goal is to gut, which we know that's a big part of this billionaire plan, then more people need to be asking the question at these town hall meetings and, reaching out to their congressional leaders saying, make it make sense. Like, I don't want to pay my taxes if there's no government. Is this just lining the pockets of Elon Musk for his next space project, or what is it for?
Let's ask ourselves this question. If we have a federal student loan program, over $1 trillion, right? And if we're going to have Head Start, and if we're going to have block grant funding for Title I schools, don't we need some infrastructure to make sure the money is well spent, lest we have the waste, fraud, and abuse that Elon Musk is essentially going after? Point one. And if, as I understand it, the United States ranks roughly, I think, 28th out of 34 nations in terms of education, particularly with respect to math, why are we literally dismantling the educational infrastructure as we're sinking in global rankings? Right? This does not make sense to me. Last point.
It makes sense, Professor Brooks, if you understand one of the goals of the right is to, keep us dumb and stupid so we don't challenge, prevent us from learning our history, prevent us from learning. One of the anchors on MSNBC says she can't use the word stagflation, because it's just her producers don't want her to use that word because people can't understand stagflation. Stagflation is not a complicated concept. we can teach people what stagflation means, but
Right.
it's the dumbing down of America. It's the rewriting of our history, this revisionism of our history that is really critically important to the right, which is why they are going after schools, which is why they are going after universities and colleges. This judge told me that one of the things these colleges they're also very, very concerned about the NIH grants, the cutting of the grants for health, the cutting of other grant programs, going after the DEI, the anti-Semitism, that whole we're going to cut your money if you're not doing enough to fight anti-Semitism. But he said endowments.
Which is interesting. I just have to say this parenthetically. As somebody who led an organization founded by Black people and Jewish people, right? Let me know that. I just find it extraordinary that you use cuts with respect to cancer research to micromanage how universities are addressing anti-Semitism, right? Meanwhile, at the Justice Department, the lawyers who can prosecute hate crimes, right, are being led by somebody with no civil rights experience at all.
Well, and how come there is pressure to make sure colleges are free of anti-Semitism, which they should do? Right. By all means, Jewish students should feel safe on campuses, right. But yet Black and brown students, dismantle DEI, rewrite, the civil rights statutes of the 60s to prevent protection for Black and brown students, but yet we value Jewish students over Black and brown students. And you just said the NAACP founded by Black and Jewish people. So the hypocrisy is just nauseating. But let me tell you what this judge told me about the endowments. He said endowments now are taxed at a very low tax rate. And Trump is threatening to, he says, 15, 25%, some outrageously high number to tax university endowments, because I was asking him the same question. Why aren't universities banding together? Why aren't these folks who have these multi-billion-dollar endowments doing more? They have the financial wherewithal, you would think, to fight Trump in ways that so many other people don't. And he says they're fearful of their endowments. Trump is coming for their endowments.
That is the thing you hear all the time, right? Everyone's concerned about an endowment tax, as well as the cuts to federal funding. But a couple of things are important to note here. Don't mistake the prominent victims of a harm as being the only victims of a harm. So we look at Harvard $50+ billion endowment, but we ignore the endowment of, for example, the University of Virginia Law School, which is so abundant, it unlike Stanford, doesn't really depend on much money from the University of Virginia, a state school. And so when we look at these schools, even schools with smaller endowments, places like Spelman, Morehouse, some of the HBCUs, were you to tax those endowments, it's not just hurting the largest and the most prominent universities, but also smaller schools, state schools, schools that serve communities where many of us come from. Those endowments are critical. And so we're at a point now where some of these HBCUs, some of these state schools are just beginning to create a nest egg, ensure that they can provide robust financial aid and robust scholarships and professorships. And at that point, right? At that point, Trump says we need to tax this. Well, if you tax this, let's tax the colleges and universities right after you tax the billionaires and millionaires who've enjoyed tax cuts, right? So you want to go out to the colleges and universities? Well, let's do that first thing, because if you even talk about doing the first thing, you never get to the second thing.
You spent a lot of time as a grassroots organizer, head of the preeminent civil rights organization in this country, the NAACP. What do you make of these people, Professor Brooks, who are now saying, oh my God, I didn't know Trump was going to do this. Oh my God, I didn't appreciate that the consequences were going to be this substantial, almost like voters' remorse. And there are just a barrage of articles out today about Kamala Harris saying Kamala Harris warned the country about Trump doing X. She warned the country about Trump doing Y. Why do you think people were so resistant to listening to whether it was Kamala Harris or you or me or the thousands, the hundreds of thousands, the millions of people who were warning the country that Project 2025 was real, that Trump's promises about retribution were real, that his plan to dismantle the federal government, to privatize it, to give more access to billionaires, just the laundry list, that all of it was real?
Well, I think the most charitable, and I think it is the most accurate reading, is not that the people were stupid or naive, but that we all collectively underestimated the power of misinformation, disinformation, and no information. So in other words, when we look at the zip codes in the country where there was no local media, that's where the dictator-in-chief got his strongest support. So in other words, those places where it was like literally information deserts. Number two, the boost and the assist this president got from abroad in terms of misinformation, or I should say disinformation, right? And the very sophisticated misinformation political apparatus that has literally inundated the people with counter narratives, so-called alternative facts, such that I don't know if the people were so much disbelieving as they were not believing much of anything. And they said, and they wanted to believe certain things about the president, right? So the president is going to do something about the inflation. We're not quite sure what. He's talking about tariffs. Or all the people I hear who say, well, we knew he was going to do something about immigration, but we didn't think this. And so in other words, it's not that people were uncomprehending. I believe they were refusing to listen, right? And the misinformation, disinformation campaigns were real and I think effective. And the reason I say that is while Black men delivered 85% of the vote for Kamala Harris, the fact that we didn't match Black women at 95% suggests that there was a real disinformation, misinformation campaign that was I think that was fairly effective.
Okay, so now that campaign, because of folks like Elon Musk and the access to information he has internally, through the White House, his ownership of one of the largest social media platforms in the world, other media outlets like Fox outperforming.
That's right.
More liberal, outlets like MSNBC, CNN, 10-1 in some cases, only suggest that disinformation campaign is only going to intensify as we move into the midterms and as we move into the 2028 election. So what do you predict in turn, maybe not predict, that's too big of a word, but, what do you say to people who are afraid that things aren't going to get better, they're going to get worse because now they've kind of figured it out. They have all the levers of government at their disposal. They have the media at their exposure. So where do we go?
Here's where I take some hope in, empirically speaking. So if the red wave didn't materialize with respect to the midterm elections under President Biden, here, there's a lot more anger in the country now. There's a lot more disappointment in the country now. We have red state congressional representatives refusing to do town halls because they know what they're going to hear.
Right.
So I draw some comfort from that. Point two, I'm hoping progressive donors understand you can either waste your money with these expensive consultants who are disengaged from the people, or you can spend some money on some of these organizations that do the real work, right? Who have credibility, and spend some money on some Black media and people of color media and women media and like literally double down on trying to convince the people who need to be convinced. Here's a little factoid that really unnerved me. President Trump spent 10 times more money on men, young men, than the opposition. And he ran up those numbers. And so I would hope progressive donors understand that we need to invest in the people who've been less enthusiastic, who have been enthusiastic. That would be Black people, right? You got to spend some money there, right? And I would hope that we spend some money focused on bringing other people to the table who have been disaffected, who've been sold a bill of goods, who are showing up at all these town hall meetings. Lastly, I think it's incredibly important that we have to invest in terms of time, talent, and treasure in our organizations, in our advocacy organizations, our activist organizations. Because we can talk about democracy every day, but unless you invest in the democracy, you're going to see less and less of democracy. And that means when these students who say things that you may or may not agree with, support democracy.
Right.
These organizations that you don't always agree with, support them anyway. Because here's what we do know. What we're seeing right now is absolutely chilling, right? When we have residents in this country who are being deported to a Salvadorian supermax without hearings, I'm just,
And complete just disregard for a federal judge. I was on a show the other day and someone asked me about that. And I said, the level of disrespect that the Trump lawyers, now the Department of Justice shows to federal judges. I mean, we've never seen anything like that. This is what would typically happen. I said, typically, first of all, you wouldn't even have the gall, audacity to step into a federal court telling a judge, I've told you enough. I don't need to tell you anymore about what we did, when we did it, or how we did it. You would be thrown under the courtroom. Your whole practice, your career would be essentially over if you worked at a big firm or a small firm or worked for yourself. It just wouldn't matter. So, I mean, they just push the envelope in ways we've never seen. I have a couple more questions before I let you go. Do you have any hope that universities are going to do something different than what they are doing? We've seen some, what I'll call profiles in courage. But do you think some of these big universities, like I said, they're not necessarily just the Ivies, but some of these other institutions that also have a whole lot to lose, are you hopeful that they are going to push back in some tangible way that we haven't seen yet?
Well, here's what I would know. Where do you have to go? If you're Johns Hopkins, where do you go? Columbia, where do you go? I would simply say to university presidents, maybe you want to look at Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin, because this president respects strength. Okay? So that may not be your preferred leadership style. Certainly nobody wants to be a dictator, but being demonstrably strong with respect to your principles when your back is against the wall is our only option. And do I think things will change? Absolutely, for a couple of reasons. If we keep going after students, cutting university budgets, threatening their endowments, threatening academic freedoms as understood and appreciated and used by professors and students, either these university leaders respond to the internal pressure as they respond to the external pressure, or there's going to be all hell breaking loose on campus, right? Let me put it this way. You can't push people but so far, right? And here's the thing. I have to say this. I have two sons who are recent college students. And they, like I felt years ago, these justice struggles aren't about issues, they're about your friends. So when you see your friends being brutalized, when you see your friends afraid, if you're friends with a Jewish student and they're fearful in terms of anti-Semitism, it says something to you. Similarly, if you're friends with Palestinian students who's subject to Islamophobia and what's going on in Gaza, it does something to you. What I'm simply saying is, in this digital age where people see the consequences of public policy in ways that are visceral and visual with some immediacy, you would be a very unwise leader to ignore that. Very unwise. And
well, I hope some of these university presidents, some of these deans are listening, because you are so right. Trump does not respond to capitulation. He doesn't respond to negotiation. He doesn't respond to, logic and reason. And, that's not how you stand up to a bully. We can just go to the schoolyard. We just keep it real simple, keep it basic, 100, whatever you want to call it. You don't fight a bully by, giving him your lunch every day. That's not going to make the bully stop beating you up and demanding not only your lunch, your dinner, your breakfast, your allowance, and everything else that you have. It's only when you muster the strength and the courage to stand up and say enough is enough to a bully that they start to back down. And we've seen that, as you said, with Trump, the way some of these countries, Canada and different ones, even Mexico, have stood up to Trump. Why the tariffs? He keeps flip-flopping and backtracking on these tariffs because these countries aren't capitulating to him. And hopefully university presidents, big law firm, management committees will learn something from these examples. Yes, you may lose some short-term dollars, you may lose some clients in this moment, but if you don't stand up to a dictator like Donald Trump, a bully like Donald Trump, you're going to lose so much more in the long term. Thank you so much, Professor Brooks, for sharing. Just thank you for sharing your invaluable insights. Obviously, this is not just an academic discussion. This is a fight for our future. It involves everyone. It's a fight for education. It's a fight for our students. It's a fight for access and equal access to justice. And this is for, I'm sure you feel this way, for me as a civil rights lawyer, I just would be remiss in this moment if we didn't fight, knowing that those who went before us, who paved the way for us, who, did so much and sacrificed so much, if we sat down in this moment, if we sat on our hands, if we didn't lift our voices, if we didn't use our platforms in this moment to do everything we can to push back, it just would be, it's just unthinkable for me and so many folks. And I'm so grateful that you at Harvard, that is under all this pressure, still being willing to speak out. We talk to a lot of professors, and a lot of folks on these campuses are so afraid that, they don't want to use their names, they don't want to be public about how they are feeling, and, no judgment on those people. Everybody got bills to pay, and, they have their own conscience to deal with, but, somebody has got to stand up in this moment. And I hope everybody's asking themselves, why not me?
Well, can I share with you a 90-second vignette on why I think we have to be
absolutely
visible and loud with respect to our resistance? So 10 years ago, after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, my colleagues at the NAACP, we did a march from Ferguson, from the home of Michael Brown, to the home of the governor in Jefferson City. And we'd received death threats via the FBI. We were subject to a near ambush by the Klan and an actual ambush by others. But my young colleagues, who were college students, as we were walking under bridges, we had all these people lining these bridges, some of whom were armed. We had every reason and we were concerned. So I told my colleagues, let's just get past this bridge, this overpass, so we can get to where we need to go. Everybody in college, all the students took out their phones and they pointed their phones at the people who were surveilling us, pointing their phones at the people with concealed weapons, because they understood as young people that visibility is protection. Speaking up offers protection. So to all my colleagues who think being quiet and demure is a form of protection, I would simply advise you to read history and to watch young people.
Yeah, cameras, Phones, game changer for sure. Well, you know, history has taught us that justice does not bend to executive orders, funding threats, or political agendas. Justice bends to those brave enough to fight for it. And bravo to everyone that understands that in this moment, we've got to be loud, we've got to be visible, and we have got to stay committed to those principles we know are the bedrock of this country. We've never achieved it, but we have to keep working and fighting for it each and every day. So thank you so much again, Professor Brooks. Thank you for watching the special report. Stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay in the fight.
Calling all BIPOC college students, recent college graduates, and clinicians. Here's my story about CORE, a unique workforce development program that is changing lives. My brother is the most caring person you'll ever meet. With his autism diagnosis, my family had to fight to make sure that the resources he deserved were available. That's why my goal has always been to help children with developmental disabilities and give them chances my brother may have missed. So when I heard about the CORE Fellowship, I knew immediately it was for me. The fellowship opens doors for myself and others like me. They offer training, a stipend while you're learning, job placement, and they'll pay up to $10,000 of my student loan debt. The CORE Fellowship is going to allow me to achieve my life's purpose. They care about me, so I can care about others, like my brother. Visit the website to learn more about the CORE Fellowship. Discover your core passion, your power, and your purpose. Apply today.